Okay, let's talk about the Salem witch trials. In 1692, in colonial Massachusetts, a tiny spark of fear just exploded into this firestorm of paranoia. And look, it's a story most of us think we know, right? But the reality? Well, it's way more complex, honestly more terrifying, and way more human than you probably imagine. So get this, in just 15 months, the hysteria completely swept through Essex Audi. We're talking more than 200 people accused of witchcraft. And these weren't just random numbers on a page. These were your neighbors, people you went to church with, even your own family. 19 of them were hanged, one poor guy was pressed to death, and at least 5 more just died in jail. It's an absolutely staggering toll. So you have to ask yourself, how does this even happen? I mean, really, how does an entire community just turn on itself like that? How does a whole society get so wrapped up in fear that it starts executing its own citizens based on, what, visions and whispers? That's the real mystery here, and that's exactly what we're going to break down. All right, so where does all this begin? Not with a big explosion, but with a quiet, terrifying shudder. In the dead of winter, 1692, inside the house of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister for Salem Village. So the Reverend's own daughter and niece, just kids really, start having these terrifying fits. They're screaming, throwing things around, their bodies are contorting into these unnatural shapes. The doctors, they had no idea what was going on. One eyewitness even said they were crawling under chairs and making these awful sounds. When medicine has no answers, what do you do? Well, the community turned to the only other explanation they could think of: witchcraft. And who were the first people accused? Well, you might not be surprised to hear they were women who were already on the fringes of society. You had Tituba, who was Reverend Parris's enslaved woman. Then there was Sarah Good, who was homeless and deeply unpopular. And Sarah Osborne, an older woman who didn't go to church much. See a pattern? They were easy targets, outsiders in a town that was desperate for someone to blame. But here's the thing you have to understand. This whole crisis didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It wasn't a vacuum. It was more like a perfect storm. All these different toxic ingredients were brewing in Massachusetts, just waiting for a spark to set them off. For starters, the whole colony was politically unstable. I mean, their legal charter from England? It had been revoked. So they were basically operating without a real legal government. Imagine that. No stable rules, no one officially in charge. That kind of uncertainty creates this massive power vacuum and a feeling that things are just not right. And at the very same time, there's a brutal war raging on the frontier. So you have all these refugees pouring into the Salem area, and they're bringing with them these absolutely terrifying stories of attacks and violence. Suddenly, the world feels incredibly dangerous, and this fear of outsiders, of the other, is just hanging in the air. And it wasn't just outside threats. Salem Village itself, well, it was kind of a mess. It was famous for being quarrelsome. People were constantly fighting about everything: property lines, whose cow could graze where, and especially about the church and Reverend Parris. All these years of petty arguments and resentment were just boiling right under the surface, just looking for a way to explode. And then you have to layer on top of all that their deeply held religious beliefs. You see, for the Puritans, the devil wasn't some metaphor for evil. He was a real, active force in the world, as real as you and me. And they believed he could give his power to actual people, witches, to do his dirty work. So when things went wrong, witchcraft wasn't a crazy theory. It was the only explanation that made any sense to them. Okay, so now you've got this terrified community, you've got a list of suspects. What's missing? You need a legal system to turn all that fear into actual executions. And that's exactly what they got when the new governor, William Phips, showed up. He set up a special court just for this crisis, the court of Oyer and Terminer. And right away, this court made a decision that sealed a lot of people's fates. They decided to allow something called spectral evidence. Now, what is that? It's basically when an accuser gets on the stand and says, "I saw the ghost or the specter of that person over there choking me in my sleep." And the court's logic, and this is wild, was that the devil couldn't take on your shape without your permission. So if someone saw your ghost hurting them, that was considered hard proof that you were guilty. This is where the logic of the court just goes completely off the rails. It was totally perverse. Think about it. If you were accused and you insisted you were innocent, what happened? You went to trial, you were found guilty, and you were executed. But if you confessed to being a witch, even if you were totally lying, your life was spared. The only way to live was to lie and say you were a witch. It was this horrible, deadly catch-22. And with a system like that in place, things just spiraled into an absolute nightmare. That summer, the summer of 1692, the executions just kept coming one after another. First, it was Bridget Bishop in June. Then, just a few weeks later in July, 5 more people were hanged, including Rebecca Nurse, who everyone in the community respected. Then in August, another 5, including a minister, for goodness sake, Reverend George Burroughs. The gallows just became this place of non-stop tragedy. Now, people were starting to have doubts. You could feel it, especially when Reverend Burroughs stood on the gallows and recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, which everyone believed a witch couldn't do. For a second, the crowd hesitated. But then, this influential minister, Cotton Mather, he's there on his horse, and he shouts to the crowd that, hey, the devil can disguise himself as an angel of light. And just like that, he squashed the doubt and made sure the killings would go on. But a fever like this, a panic this intense, it can't last forever. Eventually, it has to break. And by the fall of 1692, the hysteria had finally reached its peak, and the whole terrifying machine was about to grind to a halt. So what finally stopped it all? Well, it was a few things coming together. First, the accusers got greedy. They started pointing fingers at really powerful people, including the governor's own wife. And suddenly, the powerful people who had let this happen started to get nervous. At the same time, some brave ministers like Increase Mather started to publicly argue that using spectral evidence was wrong. This gave Governor Phips the political cover he needed to finally step in, shut down the special court, and demand real evidence. And just like that, the conviction stopped. So the executions were over, but the story was far from finished. The damage was done. The trials left these incredibly deep scars on the community, and really, a legacy that America would be dealing with for centuries. And when I say centuries, I mean it. The road to anything like justice was so long. Sure, some convictions were reversed pretty early in 1711, but then nothing for a long time. It wasn't until 1957 that more victims were formally cleared. And get this, the very last person convicted wasn't exonerated until 2022. Why? Because a middle school history class found the paperwork and pushed for it. Incredible. 329 years. Just let that sink in. For 329 years, Elizabeth Johnson Jr. was officially, on paper, a convicted witch. That's how long the shadow of this one event can be. It's just stunning. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, in the end, the Salem witch trials really were a major turning point. One historian called it the rock on which the theocracy shattered. It basically broke the absolute power of the Puritan church and government. And it became this permanent cautionary tale for America, a brutal, painful lesson about why we need things like due process and what happens when you let fear completely trample the rule of law. Which, brings us to a final, pretty unsettling question. We've seen the ingredients from 1692, right? You've got fear of outsiders, social instability, a dose of moral panic, and a rush to judgment. The real question we have to ask ourselves is, are we really so different today? What do you think the ingredients for a modern-day witch hunt would be? It's something to think about.